Here's the real jaw-dropping part. It predicted, not only did the model look just like the data, the neurophysiological data, but it predicted a new neural property in the data that we never thought to look for in the data.
So how does this new lens of thinking about brain function through dynamic oscillatory brain firing, how does that play into consciousness? You mentioned consciousness kind of briefly. How do we reconceptualize consciousness under this new lens, in your view?
Well, first of all, I have to define what consciousness
Yes,
is,
please
and that's
do
a
give your
difficult thing.
definition.
Well, when I'm going to talk about conscious, I'm not going to talk about qualia or subjective experience. I know a lot of people focus on that with conscious, so-called hard problem of consciousness, but I don't really consider that to be. I mean, it's interesting to talk about, certainly philosophy, interesting to philosophize about. People write songs and poetry about qualia and what experience is like. But I think when I'm a MIT scientist, and we like this. We're actually starting a bunch of us interested in consciousness. We have a consciousness club here now, and our slogan is we're gonna science the shit out of this. We're gonna study consciousness in a principled way, and the way we do that is we think about it in terms of brain states. Brain states.
Okay.
What are the brain states that lead to conscious thought versus what are the brain states that are associated with unconsciousness? And that's the approach we're taking. Our lab, along with Emery Brown, he's a fellow faculty member here and also a practicing anesthesiologist, we're doing this by studying the effects of general anesthesia on the brain. And we're finding that, by the way, it may be disturbing because anesthesia has been around for a long time, but medical doctors don't really know why it works. They just know that it does work. So,
Right, I remember learning that in college and being quite surprised by that as
yeah.
something that we don't really understand mechanistically.
Yeah, and there's been this tacit assumption that just somehow shuts off your cortex. Well, we're finding it doesn't shut off your cortex. Actually, it shifts the brain dynamics in very unique ways. It shifts your brain to low frequencies like the cortex, low frequencies like as if you're asleep. But it does other things like it makes the brain less stable. And it scrambles the brainwave alignment so the waves no longer match up the way they used to, right? So the point of that is that we're finding this. We have we have a paper out this year and one coming out where we show that at this level of brainwave dynamics, we find a common signature of unconsciousness across three different major anesthetics. These three different anesthetics all act on different receptors in the brain, on different parts of the brain, and one has inhibitory action, one has excitatory action. So if you ask the more reductionistic people out there, how do these three anesthetics make you unconscious? They will all say three different ways because that's all the reductionistic approach gives you. But if you look at this brainwave dynamic level, they all do the exact same thing.
Interesting.
So similarly that you can't tell which anesthetic these effects came from. Just
That's
identical.
cool.
And what that suggests to me is there may be a universal signature of unconsciousness on this brainwave level. And that's exciting for two reasons. We're working actively on this now. And that's exciting for two reasons. One is that if you have a universal signature of what makes you unconscious, it doesn't tell you exactly what the signature of consciousness is, because that's a different question, but it certainly points you in the right direction. It's a big point in the right direction of what the prerequisite is for consciousness. So that's one. The other thing is that this is something we actually monitor in the OR. The anesthesiologists monitor your heart rate and your breath rate and your blood pressure, and they're making sure you don't die, and they're making sure you're not responding to the pain of surgery. But if we can monitor these universal signals of unconsciousness using EEG, which they can be monitored, we have already done EEG experiments to show they can. You could do this in the OR and get a better control over level of anesthesia. Then better control of anesthesia means safer anesthesia. And in the elderly in our country, elderly in our country, elderly everywhere, general anesthesia is really, it can be quite dangerous. So if you can find ways um, to more carefully control the level of anesthesia, you avoid giving people too much, and you can reduce that risk. So that's a bit of a parenthetical detour of the way our lab is approaching unconsciousness and consciousness.
No,
But
it's really cool.
but to answer your question, what do these waves have to do with consciousness? Well, every major every neurobiological theory of unconscious, every like real biologically based theory of consciousness, all proposes something similar, and that is somehow your cortex forms this meta ensemble. An ensemble is a functional network of neurons. The networks all do like processing the same thing, working together, right? That's what we call an ensemble. So somehow your cortex forms this meta ensemble that unites all the processing or enough of the processing in cortex to sort of pull things together into a unified experience. Because that's what consciousness is. Right now, you're having a unified experience of sights and sounds. It's all seamless. So somehow, all the parts of your cortex that correspond to all the things you're seeing and hearing and blah blah blah, thinking, they can all somehow be on the same page. So every major theory of consciousness proposes uh, this meta ensemble. And then how they propose it is different flavor of that. But what I want to suggest is that um, consciousness, therefore, is a natural outcome of analog computing. Because think about this for a moment. I talked about how you can actually put have these waves come together and do real computation, right? So the old way of thinking about the brain with all these networks and stuff, there always was this decoder problem, right? You have a population of neurons spiking, and who's interpreting the activity of those neurons, to make a decision? And neuroscientists do things like use decoders, see if they can decode information. It all assumes there's something downstream from the neurons you're studying that is
Yeah.
somehow decoding the information. But what if instead what goes on is that your cortex is a rollicking sea of waves, right? It's being driven by spiking and it's sculpting the spiking, and I don't want to create a dichotomy here. The spiking and the electrical field waves are part of the same system.
Yeah.
That's just the electromagnetic system that's all influencing one another. It has to work that way. It's based on electromagnetic theories. There's no like spikes versus electric fields. They're all the
Yes.
same thing. But if all this waves is going on, and these waves can come together and produce some new patterns of waves. That's what analog computing is. Two waves come together, they produce a new wave pattern in a computationally principled way. And what those waves are again are patterns of excitation and inhibition in the brain. So what if all there is the brain processing, all there is the thoughts and actions are a pattern of waves across your cortex, a pattern of excitation and inhibition. That pattern is the brain state you're in right now that corresponds to what thought you're currently having. And then they have the next thought, the waves come together and they create a new pattern that corresponds to the next thought or the next action or the next perception. So all cognition is in the end, all cortical processing, and it isn't like something interpreting spiking activity and somehow decoding them into an action. It's brain states begetting brain states, wave patterns begetting wave patterns in a computationally principled way by analog computing. And you have one wave pattern creating the next one, creating the next one, creating the next one through this process. And Bob's your uncle. That's what brain cognition, thoughts, and action are. And if that's the
Interesting.
case, and I submit to you what consciousness is that when the analog computation, and this can happen locally and also in a big meta way across the cortex, because you can have local analog computation and larger scale analog computation. So I want to suggest that when these waves come out into analog computation, when they create wave patterns through this process that become organized enough to unify cortex, you have consciousness. So
Interesting.
essentially what it is all the wave patterns that they're doing computation and controlling, self-organizing the brain to create, complex thought and action and context-dependent behavior. Consciousness is a natural outcome of that because the patterns can get complex enough and organized enough to take over your cortex, and then you have self-awareness. And the thing about that means that means consciousness can then turn around and influence what goes on in the brain because it's an emergent property of the computation the brain naturally does anyway.
Very interesting. I've had a sequence. Consciousness has become a bit of a hot topic on the podcast. It's always just fascinated me. And I've had a number of different speakers from like Michael Levin and William Miller that sort of drilled into me this idea of the multi-stage self-organization of biological systems. You know, we
Totally.
think of we think of consciousness and intelligence as human level traits, but what they really kind of drilled into me is like, no, like these things, and they should probably be labeled in the same way as well. They're happening at different stages of biological systems. I'm curious, does your ideas, like, does that run into that? Is that conducive with that idea? Because you're
Oh
you're
yeah.
kind of, yeah.
Michael Levin, and like his thing about how electric fields like influence structural biology's development. So
Yes.
how does a cell on one side of your finger know it's on one side of your finger versus the other? How does the body do that? Can't do it by the genetics is too local, if you will. So his work, and hope I'm characterizing it right, but the developing body creates this pattern of electric field gradients that describe the shape of the hand, and the cells migrate along that, right? Well, I
Yes.
mean, yeah. So my man, I love that because it's beautiful, and if electrical fields can actually change how your body develops in structure, of course they're also going to have an influence in your brain as well. And in fact, and as we've been talking about for the past I don't know, hour or so, is that these waves they're having these actions on a meta level because the brain's an electrical system. So of course
Yes.
they are. Demetrius Panosis and I, who's my colleague at University College London, we propose that this also works in the other direction, down to the molecular level. So all these oscillating electric fields, what they do is they actually they work all the way down to molecular level, and they shuffle around the structural proteins that make the cytoskeleton of the brain, and we're doing that to make the networks oscillate more efficiently. Now, you ever see those pictures, those videos where you put a bunch of sand on a speaker, then you play a note?
Yes. Yeah.
What happens is the sand forms patterns, right? That's
Yes.
the idea. These oscillating electric fields are actually shuffling around the structural proteins in a pattern way to make the networks oscillate more
Yes.
efficiently. And we've drawn a lot of work by Michael Levin and others that, with how the electrical fields actually influence biological structure.
Yeah.
So these oscillating electric fields, all these ways I'm talking about, they're actually causing the structural things in the molecular level to make them network oscillate more efficiently. Now, if that's true, we also know these waves are carrying information, right? So it's a way of the brain's information processing to actually restructure the brain on the molecular level to make it process information oscillate more efficient. All works across all these scales.
Yes.
Literally mind to molecules, molecules to mind, and why shouldn't it work that way?
I completely agree, and I think it's the most beautiful story and just beautiful idea that I've ever learned. This multi-stage intelligence, consciousness, whatever words you want to use for biological systems. What I'm curious with you is like, what is the minimal state of a system where this emergent property of consciousness arises? Like, what is the most simple system in your mind where the minimal ingredient grocery list is met and you have this emergent consciousness? Can this happen in your view on the level of an individual cell?
I have no idea really. I don't think anybody does. I mean, like
Cool.
there's panpsychism theories of is that the right term, that the whole universe is conscious, like quantum theories of conscious, people like Stuart Hameroff, and
Yes.
I'm not, I'm willing to anything the evidence, I'm open to it. um so in that theory, I mean, the universe is conscious and life evolved to take advantage of the universe's consciousness. So where you draw the line between that and us, really have no idea. I know it has something to do with flexibility and planning. That when you have consciousness, you can do that. But even I'm not sure where you draw the line, because So I will say this is that, again, back to this philosophy of we're going to science the shit out of this when it comes to consciousness. Um, you know, I think we need a operational definition of consciousness just for the sake of
Yes.
its study. I'm not saying this is consciousness or this is the only thing that's conscious. We need an operational definition of consciousness to help us study consciousness, help us figure it out. And I
Yeah.
want to propose that is human consciousness. It's our operational definition of consciousness, is human-like consciousness. And the reason is, let's take a thing like an octopus, right? Octopus can do all these complex things. It doesn't have much of a central nervous system. Its nervous system is spread all around its arms, right? So if I was somehow be able to transmit my consciousness into an octopus, it would feel, I would reckon it would, I would not recognize it as anything like I recognize as consciousness.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so it could have
Exactly.
consciousness, but it's so different from us, we wouldn't recognize it. AI, in addition to AI, doing this digital computation, the other thing that AI is missing in a big way is AI only responds to inputs, right? That's not our brains. Our brains are constantly generating this constant narrative, this autobiographical narrative. That's the default, so-called default network in the brain, generating this constant narrative telling you who you are, what you're doing, what situation is, what I want to get out of it, what should I say, what should I do next. In many ways, brains are Narrative is the main thing to their brains. If you just by reading the news, you could see that many people don't check in, their brains don't check into reality often enough. But you know, so the brains work in a fundamentally different way. We're constantly
Yes.
creating this narrative, and then we're checking in with the outside world to see what to do next. Whereas AI responds to inputs. Period. So maybe AI is complex enough to be conscious. Who knows? But it's not a consciousness that we would recognize as anything being like ours. It'd be a very different form of consciousness.
Do you
So
think that
that's how I'll sidestep the issue of what's consciousness. I'll say we humans have consciousness.
No, I think it's super interesting and well explained. I'm curious if you think there's any useful way to compare human consciousness to octopus consciousness, because obviously you're completely right that consciousness is a control system for the body. I think is one useful way of thinking about it. And an octopus has 8 sort of semi-autonomous arms, so that's not, in at least in at a high level, comparable to human consciousness. But do you think there's any through line that runs from bacteria to plants to octopus to elephants to humans, where you can say this is consciousness and it's the same thing and everything, but it's very different, but it's useful to talk about it on the same continuum.
So you're not going to let me sidestep this question.
No, sorry, man. You're too
Hey, maybe.
interesting. We need to poke deep. I need to go deeper. You're too interesting a man. I'm really curious to hear.
Thanks. Flattery will get you everywhere. Um, maybe each of those octopus's arms are independently conscious, for all we know.
Right. So does that, so again, sort of, that's a sidestep again. Do you do
Yeah.
you do you think, is there anything that is a through line through all the different organisms and their consciousnesses?
Yeah, I don't know because I mean, again, this gets down to the qualia issue, right? And like again, I'm not saying that isn't important, the subjective experience of consciousness or what it feels like to be conscious. When I think about it, I think in terms of what consciousness is good for, and consciousness is good for planning behavior and countermanding habitual bad behaviors or reflexive bad behaviors. That's just particularly good for us. So we can, if we can identify signatures of that in different creatures, we could say how much of that do they have. It reminds me actually, there's this um old experiment from a long time ago by this guy named Tony Wright, who I think he was at UT Austin a long time ago. But what he did is he trained different species of animals to do a simple working memory task. You know, the working memory task is uh, I show you a picture of a house, I wait a few seconds, and I show you a picture of a house and a car, and I say, which one did you see before? You pick the house, right? That's simple working memory task. So what he did is he trained um, humans, two different species of monkeys. I'm making it's been the rodents and then pigeons. I remember that it was humans down to pigeons on a simple task like that. And what he did is he didn't give him any instructions. Had to figure out by trial and error like how you have to train animals, right? So you put a human in that situation, right? You start with three pictures: a house, a tree, and the car. And you have them one time they remember the house, one time they remember the car. That's a typical working memory task. You keep switching up what they have to remember between the three different alternatives, right? And what he did is that once the species in question learned that, got to like almost perfect performance, he then added a fourth object. And now he's adding a picture of a coconut or something like that. And the question is, how quickly does each species generalize to be able to instantly add a new object? And humans do it right away. You train humans on the three things, and then you add the coconut, the fourth thing, instantly humans get it. Boom. I figured out what the rule is. Monkeys, I think it was 56 stimuli. And with pigeons, I think it got down to like 250 stimuli, and they still hadn't fully generalized yet. So something along those lines, something along the lines of what, and the main difference there, that's what that sliding scale may be, is how quickly does each species in question build these models of the environment, build these models, do model building, um, and how much they utilize it. And humans like build models instantaneously, and then they use them instantaneously. And other creatures they don't. And so somewhere maybe along that scale is where consciousness begins to ramp up.
There might be billions of features that we're integrating into our unified conscious experience. Maybe a bacteria is integrating 20 features. I have no idea. Probably a lot more complicated than that. Maybe it's in the magnitude of hundreds of thousands or millions. And that, now, obviously the difficulty here is that you can't compute, or we can't at the moment compute how many features an organism is integrating into its subjective experience. But I kind of think of that as an interesting way that you might be able to get everything in the.
No, I agree with a lot of that. I mean, and you're capturing the essence of what's captured by these biological theories of consciousness and cortex. There's somehow there's got to be an integrative, some integration going on,
Yes. Yeah, I
right?
think the integration's key.
Integration is going to be key. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's this theory called IIT. It's Sinoni and Koch. I know that's gotten some criticism lately for not being testable or something like that. But I don't agree with that. I think, it may be difficult to test, but it's that kind of mathematical concept is that the system has to be complex enough, integrate enough information. Then the key is it has to use that information to influence itself. And that's what's so I would take everything you said. First of all, I would just remove subjective experience from that because again, subjective experience is just you can't study it because it's individual and subjective. I mean, especially if something is individual, you can't study it because everything is a case study. But I would say, I, what's that say? No, you go ahead. Well, I was just going to say that if you place everything you said and said not subjective experience, but a system has that integrate information and then influence itself, then you have an operational definition where you remove subjectivity. Otherwise, I think that still agrees with everything you said.
Yes, yes. The only reason I wanted to push back on you can't study subjective experience is because I've been doing this descriptive experience sampling methodology. Have you heard of this?
No, I have not.
It's created by Dr. Russell Hurlburt in the 1960s, I think. So it's pretty old. And basically, I carry around this box that was made in the 1960s, and it looks like it was, and it beeps me at random times in the day, and I will write down my inner experience in that moment. So I was thinking in my head about a video idea. I was seeing the color blue. I had some sensory awareness of the air coming in from the side. There was heat on my skin. Whatever it is in your awareness,
Yeah,
you write it down.
yeah, I have heard of this. I was like a psychology major. Yeah,
Yes, yeah, and this is really hard because people really don't have an idea of their inner experience. They're not good at
yep,
understanding what happened in that moment. It takes.
yep.
I did it for 10 weeks. It probably took 4 weeks of going back and forth with Dr. Hurlbut to be any good at it. But you don't think that that is a methodology that does get at subjective phenomenology? Like it's hard and it takes practice, but he's been doing this for 50 years. He's refined the methodology. I think there is elements of phenomenology that you.
No, don't get me wrong. I think that's true, and you probably get a very good description of subjective experience, which is valuable. I'm saying, but how did then you relate that to what's going on in the brain? That's where it becomes kind of an impossible task. Think about it this way, Eve Marder Brandeis, she studied lobster pyloric motion. And what pyloric motion is in your gut, food moves along. Simple as that, squeezing a tube, right? And there's I hope I get the details right here. There's three ganglion of neuron that produces pyloric motion, the lobster. And she found that you can tune up these three ganglion of neurons, tune them up in 100,000 different ways and get the same motion. And that's the way I kind of feel like subjective experience because look, the way cortex develops, you're born with way more connections in your cortex than you're going to have by the time you develop, right? You're born with all these extra connections in the world's of buzzing, overload. And then those connections get winnowed, and that's a random seed of connections, right? Random connectivity. Then experience winnows that away. So right there, right from the beginning, your cortex is wired differently from my cortex. And what the experience does is it means our brains pick up on the same statistical, realities of the world, the same things that are consistent, like corners and edges and whatnot, and peace, love, and understanding. You know, we pick up on the same things, but we're doing this on across a bed of random connectivity, and our experience is a little bit different.
Yeah.
All of our experience, all of our brain at the detailed level, all of our brains are going to be different. So, but what I'm more concerned about is what are the principles that make the brain compute and create these conscious experiences, and whether we're all experience red the same way or not, I don't care as long as we all call it red. Yeah, should I explain IIT for listeners? That help? So the idea of IIT is the information. This is um, Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch. And what it is a system has to be complex enough and integrate enough. It has to be complex enough to integrate a lot of information. Then information has got to be used to influence the system. So the way I like to think about it is imagine you have a prize committee of 20 people who are going to decide who gets this prize. And all the people on the committee, they just make their own judgments, and then they submit it somewhere, and somehow you count up the votes, and you get you get the winner, right? That may be a system with a lot of elements, but it's an unconscious system because all the elements are acting independently. Now imagine a prize committee where half the committee is cognitive scientists and the other half are molecular biologists. So the cognitive scientists deliberate among themselves and come to a consensus. Molecular biologists deliberate among themselves, come to a consensus, but they don't really talk to one another because they're in two different worlds. That's a system that's half conscious. The fully conscious system is the committee all gets together and they deliberate and they go back and forth and then they come to a consensus all together. That's a fully conscious system. That's essentially what IIT is, and it measures something called phi or phi, you know, the phi FIFO. It's a measures the metric of this along a continuum. That's IIT. No, I think that's the kind of the two things I want to add to that whole the idea of a meta ensemble is one, it's happening by brainwaves and it's happening by analog computation. And the other thing there isn't just unification of cortex, it's an organization of cortex. You're doing that to organize brain processing, right? So it's not it's and IIT kind of it's consistent with lots of elements of IIT. The system's got to integrate, it's got to unify, and it's got to organize. And this organization is influencing stuff because, as we mentioned, this whole idea about the brain waves and the brain patterns, the analog computing, is the system is creating these wave patterns to create new wave patterns, which influences itself. So I think it's very much consistent with IIT, and that's why there was some people wrote this letter complaint sent it to a journal complaining that IIT wasn't science because wasn't empirically testable, and there's a whole bunch of people who signed it. I did not because I don't really believe it. I think there might be in principle. I'm not ready to. It captures a lot, and there might be ways to capture signatures of that in neural activity, even if we haven't discovered them yet. I don't see any reasonable principle why we can't find some. I mean, not be completely testable. We can find signatures of it perhaps, and use it as a guidepost for doing other work. That's what good theories are anyway.
Yes. This is why I think I've been a bit convinced that cells are conscious, because what we've just laid out in terms of taking information from its environment, integrating it with your state, changing its state. A cell on an individual cell seems to do all of that.
Yeah,
It binds receptors in its environment. It generates information based on that environmental stimulus, self generated, based on its
but
internal
isn't
state.
isn't a lot of what the cell does though? We have these proteins in there and receptors, and with heat, these things jostle around until they just land in the right place. And I know it's a beautiful, intricate, believably complex process. Lunchroom in our lab, we have the metabolic pathway. It's like you stare to go, oh my God, how did evolution come up with that? Then you realize it's 404 billion years of evolution. But it's incredibly complicated. But in the end, is it really self-directed? It seems more like heat driving a bunch of things that lock together, in a complex environment in a complex way. But is it really self-directed? Cool. But we wouldn't recognize it as such.
Yeah. The way he said it is that since the cell binds the outside information and then self generates the meaning from that, basically from that environmental stimulus, it self generates that meaning, and it does that based on its internal state. That's where I think you get that agent behavior. That agential interaction rather than this deterministic. It's going to act like a machine, take in an input and have a set output. Since it's integrating it within its own cellular state and self-generating that information. That to me is the crux. I'm curious what how you think about that.
I haven't thought about it in that way since you mentioned it in terms of agency. I've thought about it the way I was thinking about it, which is, a lot of like random stuff happens in a beautifully intricate way, actually I just said and somehow undercuts my own hypothesis because I mean somehow is you don't want to put magic in there to make it happen. Maybe you're right. Do you think a thermostat is conscious? Yeah. IIT, some people, like I said, quantum theories, IIT would say as long as the system is processing information and influencing itself, it has some level of consciousness.
Yeah, I guess the crux for me is that if you have 100, maybe that's not even true. I've just been making an argument in my head that I don't know if it's necessarily true. If you put 100 thermometers in a room, they all act the same way. But maybe that's not even technically true because they're ever so slightly different because they're slightly, in a different place in space. So maybe that there is slightly, I don't want to say subjectivity there, but I'm not willing to go that far.
Yeah,
Who knows? The podcast, I'm getting more radical by the day about
yeah.
doing this podcast.
Let's say something else. So what we mentioned before, how you want in order to control a system, you need a model of the system. Thermostats are a great example of that. The old-fashioned thermostats, they turn on when the temperature reaches drops to a certain degree. Your furnace turns on, and you get to how it turns off, or the opposite for the air conditioning, right? So you just set two thresholds, right? That's incredibly energy efficient because you're constantly bouncing things between this range, and the range is limited by how well you can measure the temperature. So there's a lot of energy wasted. What these modern thermostats do, like the Nest thermostat or whatnot, is they develop a model of the heat dynamics of your house. They know what time of day, maybe the sun's shining on your windows, so so they don't need to know what's going on. All you need to do is they model the time of day and how heat dissipates in your house, and from that they build a model so it can actually anticipate the times to turn on and off the thermostat or air conditioning. It keeps it in a very narrow range, and now you have a more energy efficient system. So you think that's conscious?
Great question. I'm more open to the idea that consciousness can exist in non biological systems. I think I'd be open to that idea. There's nothing special necessarily about biology. So inherently, I'm not immediately like yes or no. I don't know, I guess. I think I have to plead the fifth, like you have many. I'll get one sidestep of a question, like you've taken.
Yeah, that's my sidestep. If I'm going to study it, I need a more precise definition.
Right, I understand that. And you might, for the next question, then I think you might say the same. But do you think AI can be conscious?
Again, like I think we already touched on this, is that it could be complex enough, could influence itself enough to meet the definition of consciousness. But if we were somehow our consciousness were transported into Chat GPT or whatnot, we would not recognize it. Imagine what a conscious would be like if you only had a brief flitting of it every time there was a sensory input. You'd be like totally disconnected, disjointed, no internal narrative. Or very brief. When I mentioned this, by the way, I was thing the other night where I'm talking to AI guys, and they say, "Oh, that's not true. There's an internal narrative in AI. When it responds to an input, there's these feedback and recurrent loops." I'm like, "Yeah, when it responds to an input, that's the whole point. So our brains work even when they're not responding to inputs. You close your eyes and imagine things you don't need to. So I saw a cartoon, the good example of a Turing test. You know, the robot, "Hey, let's do a Turing test," and you just don't say anything. AI only responds to inputs. So it may be conscious, maybe complex enough to be conscious, um, but it's not going to be a consciousness we recognize. And I suggest that that's going to prevent them. Every 5 years, they're going to have general AI in the next 5 years. In many ways, I really, really hope not, because that sounds a little scary. But I don't think they're gonna get there because they're not thinking about how the brain does it. And maybe you could say, and some people, AI people say, well, maybe we don't want to do it like the brain does it. Well, your brain is the only example of an intelligent thing we have. So why don't you want to do it the way the brain does it?
Yeah, probably because they can't just yet, right? They just can't really commercialize any technology that is brain like. I mean, I know they're trying with neuromorphic chips and these type of biological architectures, but
Well, speaking of neuromorphic, I'll plug one other thing because you mentioned earlier, how do you model the brain using the AI digital systems? We actually have a paper that's coming out where we have this biomimetic model that we're building. And so what we do is we're not doing it the way AI does it. Exactly what we're talking. We're not doing it by these recurrent networks and shifting connections. We say we're going to build a model on a computer platform, using digital computing. We don't have no choice because it has to be done on a computer. But it's a model that doesn't just run the way AI runs with shifting connections and simple stuff like that. What it is, we build actually biological circuits. So we have like a lateral inhibition circuit, or we have a circuit that for the striosomes in the basal ganglia, and there's a circuit for connecting it to the. These are things based on actual things you read in the literature, and we put together this model. So the model works as much like the brain as we can gleaned from the literature. And it's amazing. The way the way people normally do models is these connectionist models, right? That's the way neural network models work, like AI does. And the way people validate their models in this world is they will do things like they'll train the model on half of the data, like some neurophysiological data. Let's see if it works like the brain, right? So what they do is they'll train the model on half of the neurophysiological data to train it up and make sure all its weights changes, and you get all the nice connectivity patterns you want. And then you apply it to the other half of data. Can it solve the same problem? Does the data does it act does it model can it model the other half of the data from one half of the data, right? Yeah, that works because because you avoid the problem of just making a model that just describes what you just get it. It shows the model can generalize a bit, right? But it still is a bit of a low bar because you're training it on data to make it look like data. So our biomimetic model, it never saw any neurophysiological data whatsoever, but we trained it on the same task that we trained one of our subjects to do, a couple of our subjects to do, and compared it to their neurophysiological recordings. And the biomimetic model mimicked the brain activity to an eerie degree. I mean, it was amazing how similar it looked, even though the model never saw any neurophysiological data. And here's the real jaw-dropping part. It predicted, not only did the model look just like the data, the neurophysiological data, but it predicted a new neural property in the data that we never thought to look for in the data. And we looked for it and it was there. It was so the animal's learning this task, a category task, over by trial and error. It's learning a new category over a course of about an hour or so, right? Complex category task. And what happens is what we see in the neurons, what the model does is you get neural activity that's gradually shaped towards the categorical decision the animal's making, right? Well, there was this population of neurons that we never thought to look for, and the model predicted them, and what we first called them was bad idea neurons, and the reviewer didn't like that, so we changed it. But what the bad idea neurons were doing is they were predicting the wrong response, the incorrect response on every trial, and they got stronger with learning. Whoever the incorrect response is on that trial, even if the animal makes the correct response, these neurons are predicting the incorrect response, what the animal didn't do or shouldn't do, and they get stronger with learning. You would think, we never thought to look for them. You think, oh, with learning, the bad ideas should go away, the incorrect responses, but they're actually getting stronger. The model predicted that. And the reason why the model needs it, we think the brain needs it, is that in learning, you only get stuck down a local minima, right? You learn something, then your network's in this state, and now something changes. How do you get out of that learning? So essentially what it's doing, it's keeping a population of neurons in check to counteract the learning in case you ever need to basically move from exploit to explore mode. It gives you a reserve of energy to knock you out of local minima so you can go back being flexible and trying something else. And that was an example. I mean, I've never seen that before. You build a model, and then the model says, "Oh, these neurons." Like, no, when they first saw, I thought the model was working wrong. And then we looked in the data, and it was there. Very cool.
Giant news. We created a completely free ebook titled 26 Neuroscience Books for 2026. I've read over 100 neuroscience books in my life, and with Christmas just around the corner, I thought I would help people find the perfect book for them or to buy for someone in their life. It includes really nice science-based illustrations, an accessibility guide, and personally written segments for each book and the impression they left on me. I also asked 100 top scientists like Dr. Mike Levin, Anil Seth, Nick Lane, and many more what their favorite science book is, and you can find all of those included at the end. If you want to support the channel, you can also purchase a beautiful physical paperback copy, also a perfect stocking filler. We put a lot of effort into our first giant shoulder product, and we cannot wait to hear your thoughts. Check it out in the link below. Again, it's completely free.